A simple fence, something as ordinary as a boundary between your yard and the world, suddenly sparks an all-out war with your homeowners association. Imagine this. The HOA demands you tear it down, claiming it violates rules you didn't even know existed. But what if that fence, the one they're telling you to remove, is actually fully protected by something far more powerful? Your land's original grant. It's a game changer, and this is where the battle begins. It all started when the HOA filed a complaint about my fence. At first, I couldn't believe it. This fence, which had stood there for years, was suddenly under scrutiny. They claimed it violated some obscure rule, something I had never heard of before. As the letter arrived, I felt a mix of shock and disbelief, but I knew something they didn't. See, I wasn't just a homeowner. I was someone who had done their homework. I had spent years researching my property's history and the rights that came with it. The HOA had been pushing their weight around for far too long, and this wasn't the first time they'd made questionable decisions. I had witnessed other neighbors get bullied into compliance, often without a clear understanding of their rights. But I wasn't going to be another victim. This time, the HOA had messed with the wrong person, and I was ready to fight back. What they didn't know was that I had the perfect weapon in my hands. I live in a peaceful neighborhood, one of those rare places where families know each other by name and spend summer evenings chatting in their front yards. There's a sense of community here that's hard to come by these days. Everyone looks out for one another, and it feels like the kind of place where nothing could go wrong. But beneath the surface, the HOA is like the silent force that pulls all the strings. The HOA here runs like a well-oiled machine, but it's not exactly known for being fair. They love enforcing obscure rules that no one seems to understand fully, and more often than not, those rules feel designed to control rather than protect. From parking spaces to lawn care, they've been quick to enforce penalties without any real explanation, using vague clauses from an outdated handbook. It's almost as if the HOA thinks it has the authority to dictate every little detail about our lives. And for the most part, people complied, not wanting to stir up trouble. But when it came to my fence, something about it seemed to push the HOA over the edge. I had never imagined that something as simple as a fence could cause such a stir. It was just a boundary, something that separated my property from the rest of the neighborhood. It wasn't even that large, just a simple wooden structure that added a bit of privacy to my backyard. The kind of fence you'd expect to see in any suburban neighborhood. But out of nowhere, the HOA filed a complaint, claiming that it violated some rule about the height of fences in the community. It didn't make sense. My fence had been up for years and no one had ever said anything before. Why was the HOA suddenly so focused on it now? What could be so wrong with it that they had to take action? Their complaint felt more like a personal attack than anything else, and I started to wonder if there was more to this than just a rule violation. As I thought about it, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something they weren't telling me. The HOA had always operated with a certain air of power, but this felt different. Why this particular fence? What hidden motive did they have? Were they simply flexing their authority, or was there something more? There was a part of me that sensed that they weren't just targeting me for breaking some rule. They were trying to send a message. But what was that message? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. And I knew I needed answers before I could decide how to handle this. The tension between me and the HOA quickly escalated. What began as a simple complaint about my fence soon spiraled into something far more intense. The HOA representatives weren't just knocking on my door to have a polite conversation. They came with an aggressive attitude, demanding that I either make changes to my fence or face penalties. They insisted that my fence violated community rules, but they didn't seem to care that I'd had it up for years without a single issue. It felt less like a discussion and more like a power struggle. I tried to stay calm and explain my position. I told them that I believed my fence was well within the boundaries of the original land grant and that it had been constructed according to what I understood to be the community guidelines. But as soon as I opened my mouth, I was met with dismissive glances and condescending remarks. It was clear they weren't interested in hearing my side. They had already made up their minds. Their attitude made it feel like I was just another resident to push around, one who didn't stand a chance against their authority. I felt frustration building up, but I refused to back down. I wasn't about to let them bully me into compliance without at least understanding exactly what I was up against. That night, after the HOA's latest visit, I made the decision to dig deeper. I pulled out the old HOA documents I'd received when I first moved into the neighborhood and started reading through every regulation, every clause, and every rule they had in place. The more I read, the more I realized something wasn't right. There were contradictions, discrepancies in their enforcement of the rules, and vague references to laws that didn't seem to apply. The HOA had made a habit of enforcing regulations in a way that seemed selective, and I began to see a pattern. It wasn't just about offense, it was about control, about making examples of people they thought wouldn't push back. I felt the walls closing in as I uncovered more. What I discovered next could change everything. There were loopholes in their claims and certain legal protections that they had been conveniently ignoring. As I pieced it all together, the picture became clearer. This wasn't just about offense, or even about rules. It was about power. The HOA had been operating in a way that left homeowners vulnerable to arbitrary decisions. And in my case, they had pushed too far. But what was really going on behind the scenes? What had they been hiding all this time? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something far bigger than just my fence. It was time to find out exactly what they were hiding and how far I could take this fight. The deeper I dug into the HOA's regulations, the more I realized there was something missing in their claims. It wasn't just the vague enforcement. They were ignoring something far more crucial, the history of the land itself. My next step was to dive into the historical records of my property. I spent hours at the local archives, sifting through dusty documents, land surveys, and old property deeds. It wasn't easy, but then, buried deep in the archives, I found it, the original land grant. This document, which dated back to the early 1900s, was the key piece of evidence I had been searching for. The land grant not only outlined the boundaries of my property, but also included specific permissions for certain types of structures, including fences. I couldn't believe my eyes. The fence I had built was clearly within my legal rights, granted by the very foundation of the land itself. It was legally protected, a right that superseded any HOA regulations they tried to impose. Feeling a surge of confidence, I knew I had to confront the HOA with this. I made a copy of the land grant, highlighted the relevant sections, and waited for the next meeting. When the time came, I walked into the HOA office, documents in hand. The representatives barely looked up from their papers as I handed them the grant. But when they saw what I had, their faces froze. The shock was immediate. For the first time, I saw the arrogance drop from their faces, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. It was like a moment of reckoning for them. They had been so sure of their position, so confident that they could push me around. But now I had something they couldn't dismiss. The grant wasn't just an old piece of paper. It was the foundation of my claim. It proved that the fence, the very thing they had insisted be torn down, was entirely within my rights. The tension in the room was palpable. I could tell they were scrambling to figure out their next move. But no one said anything for a moment. I stood there waiting for them to respond, the weight of the document hanging between us. Would they back down? Or would this confrontation escalate further? I had no idea, but one thing was certain. This was no longer just a fight over a fence. It had become a battle of wills, one where I had the upper hand and I wasn't about to let go of it. The real question was, how would they react to the truth? With the original land grant in my hands, I knew this was no longer a simple dispute between a homeowner and a homeowners association. This had become a battle over legal rights and fairness. But I also knew the HOA wouldn't just roll over. They had power, resources, and influence in the community, and I had to be prepared to take this all the way. I wasn't just fighting for my fence anymore. I was fighting for the rights of every homeowner who had ever been bullied by the HOA's overreach. I consulted with experts, property lawyers, real estate historians, and legal advisors, to make sure I understood the full scope of the situation. They were impressed by the strength of the land grant, but they also warned me that this could get ugly. The HOA wasn't likely to back down easily, especially if they felt their authority was being challenged. But I was determined. We began building a case, not just based on the land grant, but on the broader history of the HOA's questionable practices. It was becoming clear that this wasn't a one-off mistake. This was a pattern. As the case moved toward legal action, I reached out to other homeowners in the community. What I discovered shocked me. Many of them had faced similar battles with the HOA, but had given up due to the pressure or the fear of being ostracized. Some had been forced to tear down structures that, like mine, were well within their rights to have. I gathered their testimonies, making it clear that this wasn't just my fight. It was a fight for all of us. The word of the battle began to spread through the community. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak out now felt emboldened. People who had kept quiet for years now stood with me. And then, the media caught wind of the story. What had started as a simple HOA dispute turned into a full-blown community scandal. News outlets picked it up, and suddenly, the issue wasn't just about my fence. It was about the unchecked power of homeowners associations everywhere. The story went viral, and the HOA found itself under public scrutiny. The case was set to go to court. I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The courtroom would be where everything would come to a head. I had undeniable evidence, the support of my neighbors, and a growing sense of righteousness on my side. But would it be enough? The HOA had deep pockets, and they weren't going to let this go without a fight. Would the court side with my historic land rights, or would the HOA's power and influence prevail? I didn't know, but the tension was building, and the stakes had never been higher. The battle had only just begun. The day the court delivered its verdict, everything I'd fought for came crashing down in an overwhelming wave of emotion. The ruling wasn't just in my favor. It was a monumental blow to the power the HOA had long abused. The judge ordered the HOA to revise its practices and policies. No more arbitrary enforcement, no more unjust fines. They were held accountable for their overreach. But beyond the legal ramifications, what truly made this victory special was the impact it had on the entire community. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. The victory symbolized a fundamental shift in power, not just in my neighborhood, but in the hearts and minds of the people who'd felt powerless for so long. When I first moved into this community, the HOA's influence was a shadow over everything. They ruled with an iron fist, dictating what could and couldn't be done with our own properties, often without regard for fairness. People kept quiet, afraid of the repercussions, too intimidated to stand up for themselves. But now that fear was shattered, as news of the court ruling spread, the tension in the air was palpable. People who had long avoided confrontation started talking. I began receiving messages, phone calls, and even spontaneous visits from neighbors who had witnessed the battle from the sidelines. They were inspired. They had been living under the thumb of the HOA's overreach for years, yet they had never imagined it was possible to fight back. Seeing someone finally take a stand gave them the courage to find their own voices. Some had issues with their fences, others with landscaping regulations, and still others had been hit with fines they couldn't afford, but no one had known how to challenge the HOA until now. They saw my success as proof that change was not only possible, but that one individual could spark a revolution. For me, that was the true reward. The legal victory was important, yes. It proved that the HOA had been wrong all along. But the ripple effect this case had on the community was far more significant. When one person stands up, when one person refuses to back down, it can shift an entire system. It was no longer just about me and my fence. It became about every homeowner in the community having the right to speak out, to challenge unfair rules, to defend their property rights. And it didn't stop there. The court ruling sent shockwaves through the HOA's leadership. For the first time, they understood that their authority wasn't as invincible as they had thought. Their unchecked power had been exposed, and now they were accountable. The sweeping reforms they were forced to enact were just the beginning. It marked the first time in years that homeowners could hope for fairness in dealing with the HOA. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I realized how much it changed me, not just as a homeowner, but as an individual. What began as a small, seemingly trivial issue escalated into a full-fledged legal battle, and in the process, I learned more about myself than I ever expected. I had to dig deep into the history of the property, delve into legal texts, and stand my ground in front of an organization I once feared. But what I discovered through this battle was far more valuable than any legal precedent or court ruling. I found the strength to keep pushing forward when it felt like everything was stacked against me, and I realized that knowledge truly is power. Armed with the truth, I could face anything, even the most intimidating forces. This fight wasn't just about protecting my rights. It was about standing up for every homeowner who had been too afraid to speak out. I was merely the first. Others followed. They saw that standing up to the HOA didn't have to be a lone battle. Together, we could challenge the institution that had long held the upper hand. The community wasn't just relieved by the outcome. They were empowered by it. They had witnessed firsthand that the system was not invulnerable. And more importantly, they learned that the actions of one determined individual could spark a change that impacted the entire neighborhood. The HOA, once a symbol of unwavering control, had been forced to adapt. No longer could they impose rules with unchecked authority. Their influence had been curtailed, and that in itself was a monumental change. They had been forced to listen, to recognize that they could no longer operate in a vacuum, unchallenged by the very people they served. The victory, however, was not just in legal terms. It was the beginning of a new chapter for the community, one where the voices of the homeowners were heard and respected. As I look back on the events, I am proud of what I accomplished. But even more so, I'm proud of what it triggered. The ripple effect from my battle with the HOA didn't just stop with my neighborhood, it spread to surrounding communities. There were whispers of change in other subdivisions, and homeowners began to organize, sharing their experiences, supporting one another, and pushing for the changes they had longed for. They realized that if I could challenge the HOA and win, they too could make a difference. And now, as I reflect on how it all unfolded, I see that it wasn't just a victory in court. It was a victory for every individual who felt their voice didn't matter. It was a victory for every community that had been stifled by overbearing institutions. The tension from the opening question, the uncertainty about whether the HOA could be stopped, had finally been resolved. The truth had come out. No matter how powerful an institution seems, knowledge, persistence, and the courage to stand up can change everything. What started with a simple fence had turned into a powerful lesson on justice, fairness, and the strength of the human spirit. This entire journey proves that one small act of defiance can alter the course of an entire community. It wasn't just about a fence. It was about standing up for what's right, understanding your rights, and refusing to be intimidated. By learning the law and fighting back, I turned the tables on an institution that had long wielded unchecked power. This story isn't just mine. It's a call to anyone feeling helpless against authority. If you stand firm, armed with knowledge and determination, you can shift the balance and inspire others to do the same.